She said if I found it, she'd be mine, but she never meant for me to try. The river didn't look deep from the bank, just a slow stretch of brown water winding past the edge of town. But anyone who'd lived out here long enough knew better, knew how the current hid its strength beneath that quiet surface, how it pulled at your boots and didn't let go easy. And that morning the sun hadn't even cleared the ridge when the laughter started, low at first, then louder as the ring slipped from Naeli's fingers and vanished into the mud-heavy flow, a flash of gold swallowed in. Less than a second, gone like it had never been there at all, and she just stood there for a moment, still as the wind around her, eyes fixed on the place where it disappeared, not panicked, not frantic, just still, like she understood something the others didn't, like losing it meant more than anyone standing there could guess. And then someone said something from behind, some joke about bad luck or clumsy hands, and that was when she turned, a faint smile touching her lips, the kind that didn't quite reach her eyes, and she said it clear enough for everyone to hear. Find it, and I'll be yours. Just a line tossed into the dust like it weighed nothing, and the men laughed again, louder this time, boots shifting, shoulders bumping, the kind of laughter that fills empty space when no one wants to think too hard about what just happened. But Ethan Cole didn't laugh. He stood a little apart from them, hat low, hands quiet at his sides, eyes moving from the rippling water back to her face, and for a second, just a second, something passed between them that no one else seemed to catch. Something steady, something that didn't belong to jokes or dares or the easy cruelty of a bored crowd, and she saw it. That much was clear, because her smile faded just a fraction, replaced by something sharper, something that measured him instead of dismissing him. But then the moment slipped, carried off by the same wind that rattled the dry grass along the bank, and she turned away like it hadn't mattered at all, like none of it had, and one by one the others drifted back toward town, boots kicking up dust, voices already chasing the next distraction, leaving the river to its quiet again, leaving that stretch of water holding more than just mud and current, holding something lost that didn't belong to anyone anymore. At least that's what they thought. And Ethan stayed a little longer than the rest, just standing there, listening to the sound of the water moving past, steady, patient, like it had all the time in the world. And then he turned too, walking back without a word, blending into the same street that swallowed everything sooner or later, the same street that had never given him much reason to stay. And by the time the sun climbed higher and the heat settled in, no one was talking about the ring anymore, no one except the man who hadn't laughed. Because that night, when the town went quiet and the lanterns burned low behind wooden windows, when the wind carried only the distant sound of cattle shifting in their pens, Ethan Cole walked back to the river alone, boots sinking, into the same bank where the gold had vanished, and he stood there again, looking out over the dark water. No laughter now, no crowd, just the slow pull of the current and the memory of a voice that had sounded like a joke, but didn't feel like one. And after a long moment, he stepped forward, the cold rising up around his legs inch by inch, the kind of cold that made a man think twice. But he didn't stop, not when the current pressed against him, not when the bottom shifted underfoot, because out here, sometimes the things people throw away without thinking are the same things someone else decides are worth everything. The water rose past his knees and did not welcome him. It never did. The river here had a way of reminding a man that it belonged to no one, not the town, not the cattle that drank from it, not even the sky that reflected on its surface, and certainly not to a quiet cowboy who stepped into it long after dark. Ethan Cole moved slow, boots feeling for ground that shifted under pressure, each step careful, measured, like he was walking into something that might remember him later. The cold bit through denim and skin until it settled into bone, the kind of cold that made breathing sharper, louder in his chest. But he did not turn back. Not when the current leaned into him, not when the mud tried to take his footing, because somewhere beneath that moving surface was a small piece of gold that had not meant much to anyone standing there that morning, except the woman who had gone still when it vanished, except the one man who had seen that stillness for what it was. He lowered himself further, hands breaking the surface, fingers disappearing into murky water, where sight meant nothing and only touch remained. The riverbed was uneven, scattered with stones and roots, smooth in some places, jagged in others, and every time his hand closed on something solid, it was never what he was looking for, just rock, just debris, just the reminder that this was a foolish thing to be doing alone in the dark. But he kept going, moving sideways along the bank where he remembered the ring had slipped, retracing a moment that had lasted less than a second in daylight, but now stretched into something longer, heavier. His breath slowed as he worked, in and out, steady, like the rhythm of the water itself, and time moved different out there. Minutes folding into something that felt like hours, the town lights behind him dim and distant, like another life entirely. He found himself thinking not about the words she had said, not about the laughter that followed, but about the way her hand had lingered just above the water after the ring was gone, the way she had not reached for it again, as if she already knew it was beyond her reach, as if letting it go had been easier than asking for help from people who would not understand what it meant. His fingers brushed against something then, small, smooth, but it slipped away before he could close his hand, carried by the current just enough to remind him how easily things were lost out here. He adjusted his stance, leaning into the pull, lowering himself further until the water reached his waist, his shirt. Not to the men who had laughed or the ones who had already forgotten, but to someone who had worn that ring long enough for it to carry weight beyond its size. The current pressed harder for a moment, shifting silt and sand, and his hand sank deeper than before, fingers sliding beneath something half buried. And there it was, not shining, not bright, just a dull curve against his skin, almost missed if he had moved too fast. He closed his hand around it without lifting it right away, holding it there beneath the surface as if making sure it was real, as if confirming that the thing he had come for was not just another piece of the river trying to trick him. And when he finally brought it up, breaking the surface slowly, the faint light from the distant town caught on it just enough to show its shape. Simple, worn, not new, not meant to impress anyone, but it felt heavier than it should have in his hand. Heavier in a way that had nothing to do with gold. He stood there for a long moment with the water still pressing against him, the ring resting in his palm, and he could have turned back then, could have left it on the bank, could have walked away and let the river keep its secrets, but he did not. He closed his fingers around it and made his way back to shore, each step slower than before, the cold following him out of the water like it was reluctant to let him go. And when he reached the bank, he did not look back at the river, not even once, because some things, once. Walking back in, clothes dry but stiff, like the night had not quite let go of him yet, his hat low, his steps steady, and in his hand, closed tight enough that no one could see what he carried. Something small that had taken the river hours to surrender. The town was waking the way it always did, with quiet routines and half-spoken greetings, men heading toward the stables, women sweeping dust from porches that would be covered again before noon, and no one paid him much attention at first. Not until he stepped into the center of it. Not until he stopped where the street widened just enough for people to gather without meaning to. And then someone noticed, then another, until the low hum of morning shifted into something else, something curious, something waiting, and she was there too, standing near the edge of the crowd like she had not intended to stay but had not left either. Nayeli, still as she had been by the river, her dark hair catching the early light, her eyes sharp and unreadable as they settled on him. Not surprised, not impressed, just watching, measuring again, like she had done the day before, and the men who had laughed found their voices returning, soft at first, then louder, asking if he had gone fishing, if he had decided to chase a joke into the dark, and someone said it plain enough for all to hear, that no man was foolish enough to believe a promise like that, not out here, not between people who did not belong to the same world. But Ethan did not answer any of them. He did not look their way. He just walked forward until the space between him and Nayeli was no more than a few feet, close enough that the noise around them faded into something distant, like wind across open land. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, the kind of silence that did not ask for words, only truth. And then slowly, without a show, without a single glance toward the crowd that leaned in to see what would happen next, he opened his hand, the gold ring resting in his palm, dull in the morning light, marked by the river but whole, unmistakable, and the air shifted, not with shock, not with excitement, but with something heavier, something that made the laughter die before it could fully form again, because no one had expected this, not really, not from a man who had never tried to prove anything to anyone, and she saw it. Not just the ring, but what it had cost him to bring it back, not in blood or spectacle, but in the quiet endurance of a choice made when no one was watching. Her eyes dropped to it for the briefest second, then lifted again to meet his, and there it was again. That same moment from the riverbank, only clearer now, sharper, like something that could not be ignored twice. And the words she had spoken before hung between them, not as a joke anymore, not as something light, but as something that demanded an answer neither of them had planned for. The crowd waited, because this was the part they understood, the part where a man claimed what he had earned, where a promise, even a careless one, turned into something real, something binding, and for a second, it looked like that was exactly what would happen, like he would place the ring in her hand and take a step closer, like he would let the story follow the path everyone expected. But instead, he held it out just enough for her to see, then shifted his hand, not offering it forward, but lowering it slightly, like he was returning something that had never belonged to him in the first place. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, steady, carrying just far enough that she could hear it without the crowd needing to. You dropped this. Nothing more. No claim. No reminder of what she had said. No trace of the long night behind him. Just those 3 words, simple and final. And it was that, more than anything, that changed the way she looked at him. Because in that moment, he stepped out of the role the town had already written for him. Out of the expectation that a man takes what he is offered. Out of the easy line between winning and losing. And into something else entirely. Something she had not expected to find in him, or in anyone. Standing in that street, her hand moved then, slowly, almost uncertain, taking the ring from his palm, her fingers brushing his for less than a second, and even that brief contact carried more weight than any of the laughter that had filled the air the day before. She turned it over in her hand, feeling its edges, the familiar shape returning to her like something remembered after too long, and the crowd held its breath without realizing it, waiting for her to say it, to remind him of the promise, to close the circle he had just opened. But she did not. She said nothing at all, and Ethan did not stay to hear what might come next. He tipped his hat just enough to mark the moment, then stepped back, turning away from her, from the crowd, from the expectation that had been building since the ring touched the water. And as he walked down the street, leaving the gold where it belonged, the silence behind him grew heavier than any words could have been, because out here, where everything was measured in what a man could take, he had just shown something far rarer. What a man could give back without asking for anything in return. The town did not return to its usual rhythm after that, not right away, because something had shifted in a way no one could quite name, the kind of shift that settles into the spaces between words, into the pauses where laughter used to live. And Ethan Cole kept walking as if he had not left anything behind, as if the silence following him was not heavier than the dust beneath his boots. He moved past the general store, past the hitching posts, past men who now watched him with a different kind of attention, not mockery, not amusement, but something quieter, something closer to respect that they did not yet know how to show. And he did not slow, did not turn, just kept the same steady pace until the town thinned out, and the road opened toward the edge where his small place waited. The same place it had always been, unchanged, untouched by whatever had just happened, or so it seemed. Back in the street, no one spoke at first, because there was nothing easy to say after a man refused something everyone else would have taken without thinking. And that was when Nayeli finally moved, not quickly, not in a way that drew attention, just a single step forward, then another, the ring resting in her palm like it had weight again, like it belonged there. And she watched him go, her eyes following the line of his shoulders, the quiet certainty in the way he carried himself. And something in her expression shifted, not soft, not yet, but less guarded than before, as if a door she had kept closed for years had been nudged open just enough to let something unfamiliar in. The crowd began to break apart slowly, voices returning but lower now, uncertain, as if the rules they had relied on had just been rewritten without their consent. Someone muttered that the man was a fool, that he had let a promise slip through his fingers, but even that sounded hollow, like words spoken out of habit rather than belief, because deep down they all knew that what they had witnessed did not fit into the simple stories they told themselves about men and women, about winning and taking, about what mattered out here and what did not. And Nayeli stood there a moment longer before closing her fingers around the ring, not gripping it tight, just enough to feel it, to remember. And then she turned, not toward the path that led away from town, not toward the land where her people waited beyond the ridge, but in the direction Ethan had gone, her steps quiet, deliberate, matching the rhythm he had set without knowing it. She did not call out to him, did not rush, because whatever needed to be said between them would not be spoken in front of a crowd that did not understand either of them. The distance between them stretched across the road, measured in yards that felt longer than they were. The sun climbing higher now, warming the dust, casting shadows that moved slowly with each step. And ahead of her, Ethan reached the edge of town where the buildings gave way to open land, where the noise faded into wind and the creak of wood from his fence line. He paused there for the first time, not turning around, just standing still for a moment as if listening to something only he could hear. Maybe the echo of the river, maybe the memory of a voice carried on the wind. And then he moved again, stepping onto the path that led to his place, the same path he had walked 100 times before without expecting anyone to follow. And that was when he heard it, not loud, not urgent, just the soft sound of another set of footsteps behind him, steady, unhurried. He did not stop right away, did not turn as if unsure whether it was meant for him or just another traveler passing through. But the steps did not fade, did not veer off, they stayed, closing the distance inch by inch until the space between them was no longer just air and dust, but something else entirely, something shared. And when he finally turned, slow, measured, the way a man does when he knows something has changed but does not yet know how, she was there, a few feet away, the ring now resting on her finger where it had always belonged, catching the sunlight in a way it had not before, not brighter, just certain. And she met his gaze without the edge she had carried before, without the challenge or the distance, just a quiet steadiness that matched his own. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, because some things, once understood, do not need words to prove they are real. The wind moved between them, carrying the scent of dust and dry grass, the sound of the town behind them fading into something far away. And then she lifted her hand slightly, not to show the ring, not to remind him of anything, just enough to let him see that it was there again, where it belonged. And her voice, when it came, was softer than before, not weaker, just different. "You could have kept it," she said, not a question, not an accusation, just a statement that held more than it seemed. And he shook his head once, simple, final. It was never mine. And that was the truth of it, laid bare in a way the town would never fully understand. And she held his gaze a second longer, then nodded, not in agreement, but in recognition, like she had been given an answer to something she had not known how to ask. And in that quiet space at the edge of town, where two worlds had always stood apart, something shifted again, not loudly, not with spectacle, just enough to change the direction of what came next. They stood there longer than either of them expected, not because there was more to say, but because neither of them seemed ready to return to the places they had come from. The town behind them still humming faintly with voices that no longer mattered. The open land ahead stretching quiet and wide like it always had. And in that space between, something unfamiliar settled, not tension, not distance, but something steadier, something that did not need to prove itself. Ethan shifted his weight slightly, glancing past her toward the ridge in the distance, the line where her world began and his ended, or at least where everyone believed it did. And for a moment it looked like he might turn back to his routine, to the small ranch that asked nothing from him except work and silence. But he did not move, not yet, because she had not moved either. Nayeli stood with the kind of stillness that came from years of knowing when to speak and when to wait, her hand resting lightly at her side, the ring catching the sun every time the wind stirred just enough to shift her sleeve. And it was different now, not just a piece of gold returned to its place, but something that carried the weight of a choice, his choice, and she knew it. She understood that what he had done was not about her words at the river, not about the laughter or the challenge, but about something quieter, something that did not belong to anyone else. "Why did you come back for it?" she asked finally, her voice even, not pressing, just asking what needed to be asked. And he took a moment before answering, not because he did not know, But because the answer did not fit into a single easy sentence, he looked out toward the land again, the dry grass bending under the wind, the same land that had taught him what mattered and what did not, and then back at her. "Because you did not laugh when it was gone," he said, simple, direct, and it was enough, more than enough, because she understood what he meant, that he had seen past the words, past the surface, had recognized the loss for what it truly was, not something small, not something to forget, and for the first time since she had stepped into that town, her shoulders eased just slightly, the guarded edge softening into something more human, more open. She nodded. Once, slow, thoughtful, like she was placing his answer somewhere she would not lose it again, and the wind carried a long breath between them, quiet, unhurried, and then she did something unexpected, not dramatic, not sudden, just a small shift forward, closing the distance by a single step, enough to change the space between them from separate to shared. "In my world," she said, her voice lower now, steady as the ground beneath them. "When someone returns what was lost, it is not forgotten." She did not look away as she said it, did not hide behind distance or silence, just let the words stand where they were, and he met them without flinching, without stepping back, because out here, words carried weight when they were spoken like that, without decoration, without expectation, just truth. He nodded once, not agreeing, not disagreeing, just acknowledging, because he knew the same thing in his own way, knew that some action stayed with a man long after the moment passed, and that was when she turned slightly, glancing toward his land, the worn fence line, the small house that sat alone against the horizon, and then back at him. "You live there," she said, again not a question, just an observation, and he followed her gaze. "It keeps me busy," he replied, the faintest trace of something almost like humor in his voice, but not quite, just enough to show he was not made entirely of silence. She considered that, the way he said it, the way he stood, the way he had walked into a river for something that was never his to claim, and something in her expression shifted again, deeper this time, like she was seeing more than just the man in front of her, like she was seeing the space around him, the life he had built without asking anything from anyone else. And she stepped back then, not retreating, just resetting the distance, giving the moment room to settle. "Then you should get back to it," she said, calm, certain, but there was something else beneath it now, something unspoken, and he inclined his head slightly, a gesture that carried more respect than any words could have, and he turned once more toward his land, taking a step forward, then another, the path. Familiar beneath his boots, but different now in a way he could not fully explain, and behind him, she did not follow this time. Not yet. She remained where she was, watching him go, not with distance, not with doubt, but with something steadier, something that had taken root in the quiet space between a lost ring and a returned one. And as he walked, the wind picked up again, carrying dust across the path, soft, constant, like the land itself was reminding them both that nothing out here stayed the same for long, except maybe the things that were chosen, not taken, and in that silence, where no one else was watching, the story between them shifted once more, not toward an ending, but toward something that had only just begun. The days that followed did not announce themselves as different, not in any way the town could point to or measure, but something had settled into the air between sunrise and dusk, something quieter than talk, deeper than curiosity, and Ethan Cole felt it, without naming it, the way a man feels a change in weather before the clouds gather. He moved through his routine the same as always, mending fence lines, checking water troughs, walking the length of his land with the steady patience that had shaped his life long before anyone noticed him. But there were moments now, small ones, when his gaze drifted beyond the work in front of him, out toward the ridge where the land rose and fell into another world, a place he had never stepped into, and never expected to, and he would pause there, just for a breath, before returning to what needed doing, as if acknowledging something without fully turning toward it. And in the town, the story had not faded the way most things did. It had not been swallowed by the next piece of gossip or the next passing trouble. Instead, it lingered, repeated in quieter tones, less certain each time, because no one could quite agree on what it meant. Some said he had made a mistake, that a man should never walk away from what he had earned. Others said nothing at all, because deep down they understood that what he had done did not fit into the rules they lived by, and that made it harder to dismiss. Nayeli did not return to the river, not in those days. But she did not leave either. She remained near the edge of the town, moving through it in her own way, unnoticed when she chose to be, seen when it did not matter. Her presence no longer carried the same tension it once had, but it had not softened into acceptance either. It existed somewhere in between, like a question the town had not yet answered. And once, near midday when the sun stood high and the dust settled heavy on everything, she walked the road that led toward Ethan's land, not with urgency, not with hesitation, just a steady pace that matched the rhythm of her thoughts. The distance stretched out in miles that felt shorter than they had before, and when she reached the edge of his property, she did not step onto it right away. She stopped at the fence line, resting her hand lightly against the worn wood, feeling the texture beneath her fingers. The years it had stood there marking a boundary that had never needed words, and beyond it, she saw him, moving along the far side, checking a section of fence that had leaned slightly under the weight of time and weather. He did not notice her at first, his attention fixed on the work, hands steady, movements efficient, and she watched him for a moment, not studying him the way she had before, not measuring, just observing, like someone seeing something clearly for the first time without needing to question it. And then the wind shifted, carrying her presence just enough that he paused, his hand resting on the post as he turned his head, his eyes finding her without surprise, as if part of him had expected this without knowing why. Neither of them spoke right away, the distance between them marked by the fence, simple, unbroken, a line that had always meant more to others than it did in that moment. And after a few seconds, he walked toward her, not fast, not slow, just the same steady pace he carried in everything, stopping a few feet from where she stood, close enough to speak without raising his voice, far enough to leave space for choice. "You found your way," he said, the words plain, but not empty, and she gave a slight nod, her eyes moving briefly over the land behind him, the open space, the quiet order of it. "It is not hard to follow someone who walks in a straight line," she replied, and there was something lighter in her voice now, not quite humor, but close enough to feel it. He glanced back at the fence he had been fixing, then at her hand resting on the wood, and without saying anything more, he stepped past her, picking up a tool from the ground, adjusting the post with a practiced motion, tightening what had loosened, and she did not move away, did not step back from the boundary. Instead, she watched, the simple act of work unfolding in front of her, steady, unhurried, and after a moment, she reached out, her hand moving to the top rail of the fence, pressing down just enough to hold it steady as he secured it. A small gesture, almost nothing, but it changed the space between them again, from separate to shared, and he noticed it, not with surprise, not with hesitation, just a brief glance, an acknowledgement, before finishing the task. And when he stepped back, the fence stood firm again, the line restored, but not in the same way it had been before, because now it carried the imprint of two sets of hands instead of one. And for a moment, they both looked at it, not as a barrier, but as something else entirely, something that could hold weight without dividing. And the wind moved across the land again, softer this time, carrying with it the quiet understanding that some lines, once crossed without being crossed at all, are never the same again. The fence stood straight between them, but it no longer felt like something that kept one world from the other. It felt like something that had been tested and chosen to remain, and Ethan rested his hand on the post for a second longer than needed, as if confirming it would hold, not just against wind or time, but against whatever quiet shift had taken root since the river. Nayeli did not move away when he stepped back. She stayed where she was, her hand still on the wood, her gaze moving along the line of the fence as it stretched out across the land, following it until it disappeared into the dry grass and heat shimmer. "You built all this alone," she said after a moment, her voice carrying that same calm weight, not admiration, not disbelief, just recognition, and he gave a small nod. "It does not take many hands if you do not plan on leaving," he replied, and there was something in that answer, something that spoke of years spent choosing stillness over movement, silence over company, and she understood that too, though her path had been different, shaped by people, by history, by ties that could not be set aside as easily as a fence post. She let her hand fall from the wood then, stepping back half a pace, not retreating, just shifting the space between them again. And for a moment it seemed like she might turn, might leave him to his land the way she had before, but she did not. Instead, she looked out across the open stretch beyond his house, the way the land rolled gently before rising toward the ridge, and something in her expression changed, something more distant, more thoughtful. My people used to pass through land like this, she said quietly, before lines were drawn where none existed. Her words were not heavy with blame, not sharp, just true, like something carried for a long time and spoken only when it mattered. Ethan followed her gaze, seeing the same land he had walked for years, but hearing it differently now, as if her voice had shifted something in how it was held. And he did not argue, did not defend, because out here, some truths did not need answers, only acknowledgement. It is not the land that changed, he said after a moment, his voice steady, just the way men decided to stand on it. And she glanced at him then, a brief look, sharp and searching, before it softened again, because that was not the answer she expected, not from him, not from anyone standing on this side of the fence. And the wind moved through again, brushing past them both, carrying the scent of dry earth and distant water. And in that quiet, something settled, not agreement, not resolution, but understanding, the kind that does not erase what came before, but makes space for something new beside it. Ethan turned then, moving toward the small stack of tools near his house, picking up a coil of wire, adjusting it without looking back, not dismissing her, just continuing the rhythm of his day. And she watched him for a moment longer, then did something neither of them had planned. She stepped over the fence, not dramatically, not with hesitation, just a simple movement, one foot, then the other, crossing the line that had stood there long before either of them had arrived. And the sound it made was almost nothing, a faint shift of wood under weight, but it carried further than any word spoken that day. Ethan heard it, of course he did, and he paused, the wire still in his hands, not turning immediately, giving the moment space to exist before he acknowledged it. And when he did turn, she was standing on his side of the land, not claiming it, not challenging it, just standing there as if she had always had the right to be. And for a second, the air between them tightened, not with tension, but with the weight of what that step meant. And then it passed, because neither of them treated it like something forbidden, something dangerous. It was just a step, just a choice. And that made it something else entirely, something real. The fence still stands, she said, her voice calm, almost reflective, and he nodded once. It does, he replied, and there was no contradiction in that, no confusion, because the line remained, but it no longer decided what could and could not cross it. She walked a few steps further in, slow, unhurried, her eyes taking in the land not as something foreign, but as something she could understand in her own way. The patterns of grass, the direction of wind, the quiet signs that told a story to those who knew how to read it. And he watched her without stepping forward, without stepping back, letting her move as she chose. Because out here, control was not something you forced, it was something you respected. And after a moment, she stopped, turning back to face him, the distance between them smaller now, but not closed, not yet. You fixed the fence, she said, but you did not ask me to stay on one side. And there was something in that, something that reached beyond the words themselves. And he met her gaze, steady as always. It holds what needs holding, he answered. And that was all. No explanation, no condition, just a truth offered the same way he had offered the ring, without asking anything in return. And she stood there, the wind moving softly around them, the land stretching wide in every direction. And for the first time since she had stepped into his world, it did not feel like crossing into something it felt like stepping into something that had been waiting without knowing it. And neither of them rushed to fill the silence that followed, because out here, silence was not empty. It was where the most important things were allowed to settle, slow and certain, like the land itself. The land did not protest her presence. It did not shift or harden beneath her feet, as if rejecting the step she had taken. It remained what it had always been, quiet, open, patient. And that was what made the moment heavier than it looked, because nothing in the world around them tried to stop her. Only the weight of habit and memory ever had. Ethan watched her for a while without speaking, not out of hesitation, But because there was nothing in what she had done that required immediate words, some things, once chosen, needed space to settle before they were understood, and she seemed to know that too. The way she stood there, not claiming the ground, not testing it, just existing on it like it was another part of a path she had already been walking long before she reached his fence. The wind moved through the tall grass behind her, bending it in slow waves that caught the sunlight, and for a moment it looked like the land itself was breathing, steady, unbothered by the lines drawn across it by men who believed they could define it. "Does it feel different?" he asked after a while, his voice calm, not probing, just curious in the quiet way he carried curiosity, and she turned her head slightly, looking down at the ground beneath her boots, then out toward the horizon, and finally back at him. "No," she said, simple, honest. "Only the way I stand on it does." And that answer lingered between them, because it held more truth than anything louder ever could. Ethan nodded once, as if he had expected nothing else, and then he moved again, not away from her, but toward the small shed near his house, the one that held tools and things that needed fixing. And he opened the door, the wood creaking softly in the dry air, revealing the dim interior where light filtered through narrow gaps. He stepped inside for a moment, then came back out with a small metal bucket and a length of rope, moving with the same steady purpose as always, as if the world had not shifted at all. But there was something different in the way he set the bucket down near the well, something that felt less like routine and more like continuation. Nayeli watched him, her gaze following the movement, not questioning it, just observing. And after a moment, she walked closer, not hesitating now, the distance between them closing in a way that no longer felt uncertain. She stopped near the well, her eyes moving over the worn wood, the rope, the bucket, all of it simple, all of it used, all of it part of a life built piece by piece. "You carry water from here every day," she said, not asking, just understanding, and he nodded. "Every day it needs carrying," he replied, and there was that same quiet rhythm in his words, the kind that did not measure time in hours but in tasks, in things that had to be done whether anyone was watching or not. She reached out then, her hand brushing lightly against the rope, feeling its roughness, the fibers worn smooth in places by years of use. And without asking, she took hold of it, lowering the bucket into the well with a controlled motion, the rope sliding through her fingers, steady, practiced in a way that did not come from this place, but from a different one, a different life. The bucket hit water below with a soft echo, and she waited a moment before pulling it back up, her movements even, deliberate, and Ethan watched, not stepping in, not correcting, just letting her do what she had chosen to do. And when the bucket reached the top, full and heavy, she set it down beside the well, the water catching the light in small, shifting reflections, and for a second, neither of them spoke, because the act itself had already said something about shared work, about quiet understanding, about the way two lives that had never crossed before could begin to move in the same direction without needing permission. "In my world," she said after a moment, her voice softer now, less guarded than it had been before, "we do not take water without leaving something in return." And she slipped her hand into the small pouch at her side, drawing out a thin strip of leather tied with a small bead, worn but carefully kept. And she placed it on the edge of the well, not offering it to him, not explaining it, just leaving it there as if the act itself carried all the meaning it needed. Ethan looked at it, then at her, and he did not reach for it, did not question it, because he understood enough to know that some things were not meant to be taken immediately. Some things were meant to remain where they were placed, to exist as a gesture rather than an exchange. He gave a slight nod, acknowledging it without claiming it, and she met that nod with one of her own, the kind that did not need further words. The wind moved again, lifting a strand of her hair, carrying the faint scent of water and dust between them, and the sun climbed higher, casting longer shadows that stretched across the ground, blending together where they met. And in that quiet space, with the bucket of water between them and the small piece of leather resting on the well, something settled deeper than before, not a promise, not a bond defined by words, but a shared understanding that had grown from a single act by a river into something that neither of them could have named at the start, and neither of them tried to. Because out here, the strongest things were not the ones spoken aloud. They were the ones carried forward, step by step. Without needing to be explained, the bucket of water sat between them like something more than it was, catching the sunlight in small ripples that moved with the breeze. And the strip of leather she had left rested quietly on the edge of the well. Untouched, not forgotten, just waiting. Ethan moved first, not away, not toward her, but around the space they had created, lifting the bucket with both hands and carrying it toward the trough near the fence, his steps steady, the weight of the water balanced without strain, and she followed with her eyes, watching the way he worked, not rushed, not delayed, just done when it needed doing, the kind of rhythm that did not ask for attention but held it anyway. And when he poured the water, letting it settle into the worn wood of the trough, the sound was soft, steady, like something returning to where it belonged. He set the empty bucket down and turned back, his gaze passing briefly over the leather piece again, still where she had placed it, and then to her. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, because there was no need to explain what had already been understood. The air between them had shifted again, not with tension, not with expectation, but with something quieter, something that had begun to take shape without either of them forcing it. Nayeli stepped closer to the trough, her hand brushing lightly against the edge, feeling the water's coolness, the simple necessity of it, and she glanced toward the horizon again, where the ridge stood distant and unmoving. "You live far from others," she said, her voice carrying that same steady tone. Not judgment, not curiosity, just observation, and he nodded. "Far enough," he replied, and there was a pause after that, one that held more than silence, because distance meant different things to each of them, meant choice for one, meant separation for the other, and she seemed to consider that, her gaze lowering slightly. Understand, but because he did, completely, he looked out toward the same horizon she had been watching, the line between what was known and what was not. And then back at her. "Most things worth doing are noticed," he said, and his voice held no challenge, no push, just truth. And she turned her head slightly, meeting his eyes again, searching for something there, maybe doubt, maybe hesitation, but finding neither. Only the same quiet certainty he had carried since the river, and that seemed to settle something in her, not completely, not all at once, but enough. Enough to take the next step without needing to see the entire path ahead. She exhaled slowly, a breath that carried more than the moment itself, and then she moved, not away, not back toward the fence, but further in, past the well, past the trough, toward the open stretch of land behind his house, her steps unhurried, deliberate, like she was choosing each one. And Ethan watched her go, not following, not stopping her, just letting her move as she needed to. Because out here, nothing real was built by forcing direction. It was built by allowing it to unfold. The wind picked up again, brushing through the grass, lifting dust that settled just as quickly. And for a moment, the world felt larger, wider, like the space between them had expanded even as the distance closed. She stopped near the edge of the open field, turning slowly to face him again. And there was something different in her expression now. Something clearer, something decided. "In my world," she said, her voice steady, carrying across the space between them without strain. "When something is returned, it creates a path." She paused, just long enough for the words to settle. Not for taking, but for walking. And the meaning of it did not need explaining. Not here, not between them. Ethan stood where he was, the sun at his back, the land stretching behind him. And he gave a small nod, not claiming the path, not defining it, just acknowledging that it existed now, because of a choice, because of a moment by the river that had grown into something neither of them had planned, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of possibility, of uncertainty, of something that would take time to understand, and neither of them rushed to fill it. Because out here, the strongest things were the ones that did not need to be named right away. They were the ones that revealed themselves slowly, step by step. As long as someone was willing to walk the path she spoke of did not appear on the ground. It did not cut through the grass or leave marks that anyone else could follow, but it existed just the same, stretching between them in a way that neither of them could deny now. Ethan stood where he was for a moment longer, letting her words settle into the quiet of the land, and then he moved again, not toward her, not away, but along the line of work that had always defined his days, because out here, Even when something changed, the land still asked for the same things: water to be carried, fences to be checked, ground to be walked. And he trusted that if the path she spoke of was real, it would not vanish just because he continued moving forward. Naeli watched him as he resumed his work, the steady rhythm of his steps, the way he bent to adjust a loose board near the trough, the way he did not look back to see if she followed. And there was something in that mattered, something that told her he was not trying to lead her, not trying to guide or claim the direction of what had begun between them. He was simply continuing, leaving the choice of whether to walk beside him entirely in her hands. And for a while, she did not move. She stood there in the open space, feeling the weight of that choice, the quiet pull of two worlds that had always stood apart. One behind her beyond the ridge, one in front of her across this stretch of land, and neither of them calling her loudly, neither demanding, only existing, waiting for her to decide where her steps would fall next. The wind shifted again, stronger this time, carrying dust across the ground, brushing against her face, her arms, the fabric of her clothing, and she closed her eyes for a brief moment, not to escape it, but to feel it fully, to let it remind her of where she stood. And when she opened them again, the answer had already begun to take shape, not complete, not certain in every direction, but clear enough for the next step. She moved then, not back toward the fence, not toward the ridge, but forward, closing the distance between them once more, her steps quiet, deliberate, the kind that did not ask for permission, only for space. And Ethan heard her this time without turning, the faint sound of movement behind him enough to tell him what he needed to know, and he did not stop, did not pause his work, because stopping would have made it something else, something heavier than it needed to be. Instead, he continued, allowing her to come as she chose, and when she reached him, she did not stand apart as before. She stopped beside him, close enough that their shadows touched on the ground, blending at the edges where the sunlight met them, and for a moment, they worked in silence, he adjusting the boards, she steadying them when needed, no instruction given, none required, the rhythm forming naturally, as if it had been there waiting all along. And after a while, when the task was done, when the last board was set and the structure held firm again, she stepped back slightly, looking over what they had done, and then at him, her expression calm, but carrying something deeper now, something that had moved beyond observation into decision. This path, she said quietly, it does not end where we stand. And he looked at her then, not questioning, not doubting, just listening, because he understood that what she was saying was not about the land beneath their feet, not about the distance between the fence and the ridge, but about something else entirely, something that had begun with a small act and grown into something neither of them could measure in miles or boundaries. No, he said simply, and there was no need to add more, because they both knew that whatever this was, it was not something that could be contained in a single moment or a single place. The wind eased again, settling into a softer rhythm, and the land stretched out around them, wide and open, holding more than it had before, and for the first time since she had stepped into this space, Naeli allowed herself to stand fully within it, not as a visitor, not as someone passing through, but as someone who had chosen to remain, at least for now. And Ethan, standing beside her, did not treat it as something temporary, did not question how long it would last, because out here, time was not something you held on to, it was something you moved through, one step at a time. And the path they had begun to walk did not ask for certainty, only for willingness, and in that quiet understanding, with the land open before them and the past still present but no longer dividing, they stood side by side, not bound by promises spoken in jest, not defined by the expectations of others, but connected by something far simpler and far stronger, a choice made without demand, without claim, and carried forward without needing to be explained. The sun had begun its slow descent by the time the work between them found its natural pause, not because there was nothing left to do, but because something else had taken its place, something quieter but no less real, the kind of shift that did not interrupt a man's day but changed the way he moved through it. Ethan leaned back slightly from the fence line, wiping his hands on a worn cloth, his gaze drifting out across the land as it caught the softer light of late afternoon, the shadows stretching longer now, blending edges that had been sharp under the noon sun. And beside him, Naeli stood without speaking, her presence no longer something that needed to be acknowledged each moment. It simply was, like the wind or the ground beneath their feet, steady and certain. But the quiet did not last the same way it had before, because beyond the edge of his land, where the road curved back toward town, there was movement, distant at first, barely more than a shift in dust against the horizon, but enough to draw the eye of anyone who knew what to look for. Ethan noticed it first, not with alarm, just with the kind of awareness that came from years of watching the land for anything out of place. He narrowed his gaze slightly, measuring the distance, the direction, and then he glanced toward Naeli, not to warn, not to question, just to share what he had seen without needing to speak it. And she followed his look without hesitation, her eyes sharpening as they fixed on the same point in the distance. And for a moment, neither of them moved, because the land itself seemed to hold its breath, the wind easing just enough to let the dust settle into a clearer shape. A rider, maybe two, maybe more behind, still too far to count, but close enough that their approach was no longer uncertain. And there was something in the way they rode, not hurried, not careless, but purposeful, like men who knew exactly where they were going. And for the first time since she had stepped across the fence, Naeli's posture shifted, not into fear, not into defense, but into awareness, the kind that comes from understanding that the path she had chosen was now visible to others, not just to the man standing beside her. "They will have seen me come here," she said quietly, her voice steady but carrying the weight of truth. Not complaint, not regret, just acknowledgement. And Ethan gave a small nod, his eyes still on the horizon. "Then they will know where you stand," he replied, and there was no judgment in it, no push to step back, no suggestion to return to where she had come from, just a statement as simple as the one she had made. And that was what mattered, because in that moment, he did not try to shield her from the consequences of her choice. And he did not question it either. He simply stood with it, as he had stood with everything else. And she heard that, understood it for what it was, and something in her expression settled again, not closing, not hardening, just becoming clearer, like a line drawn not in the dust but in the mind, something that would not be erased by wind or time. The riders drew closer, their forms more distinct now, horses moving steady, not fast, not slow, and as they approached, the space between the two figures at the fence line did not change, did not widen, did not close. It held, steady as the land itself, and Ethan did not step forward, did not reach for anything, because there was no need. The moment was not about force or defense. It was about presence, about where a man chose to stand when the world around him took notice. And Naeli did not step back, did not return to the fence, did not reclaim the distance she had crossed. She remained where she was, her shoulders straight, her gaze fixed ahead, not defiant, not yielding, just certain. And as the riders came within speaking distance, slowing their horses near the edge of the land, the air shifted again, not with tension, but with recognition, because this was no longer just a quiet path walked between two people. It had become something visible, something that others would see and measure in their own ways. And yet, in that moment, none of it seemed to matter as much as the simple fact of where they stood, side by side, not bound by words, not defined by the expectations of those approaching, but grounded in a choice that had already been made. And as the first rider drew to a stop, the dust settling slowly around him, the silence held for one more breath, long enough for everything unspoken to settle into place, long enough for both of them to understand that whatever came next would not change what had already begun, only reveal it more clearly. And in that stillness, with the land stretching behind them and the riders before them, the path they had started was no longer hidden. It was there, visible, undeniable, and waiting to be walked forward. No matter who chose to watch, the rider did not rush his horse as he approached, did not raise his voice or signal the others behind him. He simply came to a steady stop a few yards from the edge of the land, the dust settling slowly around him as the late sun cast long shadows across the ground. And for a moment, no one spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because each word from this point forward would carry weight beyond the moment itself. Naeli did not step forward to meet him, did not step back to create distance. She remained where she was, her posture calm, her presence grounded in the choice she had already made, and Ethan stood beside her, not ahead, not behind, just there, the same way he had been since the river, the same way he had been when there was no one watching. The rider's gaze moved from her to him, then back again, measuring, not with suspicion, not with judgment, but with the quiet awareness of someone who understood that what stood before him was not easily explained. "You crossed into this land," the rider said at last, his voice even, carrying the cadence of someone used to being heard without needing to raise it. And Naeli gave a slight nod, not defensive, not apologetic, just acknowledging what was already clear. "I did," she answered, her voice steady, and the wind moved between them, carrying the scent of dry earth and the faint trace of water from the well behind. The rider studied her for a moment longer, then let his gaze shift again, this time resting on Ethan, and there was a pause there, a different kind of pause, one that held more than simple observation, because in that moment, the question was not only about where she stood, but why she was allowed to stand there at all. Ethan did not look away, did not lower his gaze. He met it the same way he had met everything else, quiet, certain, without the need to prove anything beyond what had already been done. And that was what answered the unspoken question more clearly than any words could have. The rider exhaled slowly, not in frustration, not in relief, just in acceptance of something that did not fit into the expectations he had carried with him. "This will not go unnoticed," he said, not as a warning, not as a threat, just as truth, the same truth Naeli had already spoken herself, and she inclined her head slightly. "It already has," she replied, and there was no hesitation in her voice, no trace of doubt, because the moment had passed the point where it could be hidden or undone. The other riders behind him shifted slightly, their horses stepping in place, not restless, just aware, and the land seemed to hold steady around them, as if waiting to see what would come next. And then something changed, not in the air, not in the land, but in the way the rider held himself, a subtle shift, almost imperceptible, like a line being redrawn in a different place than before. He looked at her again, not as someone who had crossed a boundary, but as someone who had chosen a path. And then he gave a small nod, not approval, not permission, but recognition, the kind that did not need to be spoken aloud to be understood. "Then you will walk it," he said. And there was no more to it than that. No demand, no condition, just the acknowledgement of a choice that had already been made. And for a moment, the silence returned, but it was not the same silence as before. It was fuller, settled, like something that had found its place without needing to be forced into it. Naeli met his gaze once more, then shifted her attention back to the land beside her, to Ethan, to the space that now felt different not because it had changed, but because she had. And Ethan remained as he was, steady, present, not stepping forward to claim anything, not stepping back to avoid it, simply standing where he had chosen to stand. And that was enough, more than enough, because in that moment, what mattered was not what others saw or said, but what had already been set into motion by a simple act, a returned ring, a quiet choice, a step across a line that no longer held the same meaning. The rider turned his horse then, not abruptly, not with finality, just with the same calm purpose he had arrived with. And the others followed, their movements slow, deliberate, carrying no urgency, only the understanding that what they had come to see had already revealed itself. And as they rode away, the dust rose once more, drifting across the land before settling again, leaving the two figures at the fence line where they had been all along, unchanged in position, but not unchanged in what they represented. The sun dipped lower now, the light softening, stretching the shadows further until they merged completely on the ground. And in that quiet, with the land open and the path ahead no longer hidden, the weight of what had just passed did not press down on them. It lifted something instead, something that had once kept their worlds apart. And what remained was simpler, clearer, a space where two people stood not because they were told to, not because they were expected to, but because they had chosen to. And that choice, once seen, once recognized, did not need to be defended. It only needed to be carried forward. The dust settled long after the riders disappeared beyond the curve of the land, long after the sound of hooves faded into something the wind carried away without memory. And what remained was not silence, not the kind that comes from emptiness, but the kind that follows understanding, the kind that lingers because something has been seen clearly and cannot be unseen. Ethan did not move right away, his gaze still resting on the horizon where the figures had vanished, not watching for their return, not expecting anything more, just allowing the moment to finish its course the way it needed to. And beside him, Naeli stood with the same quiet steadiness. Her shoulders relaxed now, not because the world had become easier, but because she no longer carried the same weight of uncertainty she had before. The path she had chosen had been acknowledged, not challenged, not denied. And that changed something fundamental, not in the land, but in how she stood upon it. The wind softened as the sun dipped lower, casting the kind of light that turned everything warmer, gentler. Even the hard edges of the fence and the worn boards of the trough seemed to lose their sharpness. And for a moment, the world felt like it was holding its breath again, not in tension this time, but in quiet acceptance. Ethan finally turned, not toward the town, not toward the ridge, but toward the well, his steps measured, familiar, and he reached for the bucket without looking back, lowering it once more into the water below, the rope sliding through his hands with the same steady rhythm as before, as if nothing had interrupted the day at all. And in a way, nothing had, because out here, even the moments that changed everything did not stop the need for water, for work, for the simple acts that carried a life forward. Naeli watched him for a second, then moved as well, stepping closer, her presence aligning with his without needing direction. And when he pulled the bucket back up, she was already there, her hands meeting the rope just below his, steadying it without a word. And together they lifted it, the weight shared, balanced, natural in a way that felt both new and familiar at the same time. And when the bucket reached the top, they set it down side by side, the water inside catching the last light of the day, reflecting something that could not be named but was clearly there. And for a moment, neither of them let go, their hands resting on the rope, close but not touching, the space between them no longer something to measure or define, just something that existed without needing explanation. In my world, she said quietly, her voice softer than it had been before, carrying not just strength but something closer to peace. A path is not proven by those who watch it, only by those who keep walking. And the words settled into the space between them the way the dust had settled on the land, naturally, without force. Ethan gave a slight nod, his eyes lifting from the water to meet hers, steady as always, but with something deeper now, something that had grown from a single act into something that would not easily fade. Then we keep walking, he said, simple, unadorned, but final in its own way. And she held his gaze for a moment longer, then nodded in return, not as agreement, but as recognition, the kind that did not need to be repeated to be understood. The sun slipped lower, dipping behind the ridge in the distance, and the shadows stretched until they merged completely at their feet, no longer separate, no longer divided, just one shape against the ground. And in that quiet, with the day coming to its close and the land holding steady beneath them, there was no need for promises, no need for declarations, because what had been built between them did not rely on words. It relied on choice, on action, on the quiet understanding that some things are not taken, not claimed, but given back. And in that giving, something greater is found, something that does not belong to one side or the other, but to the space between. And as the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, faint but certain, they stood there a moment longer, not as strangers, not as opposites, but as two people who had stepped beyond what was expected of them, and found something else waiting, something quieter, stronger, and far more enduring than anything a promise spoken in jest could ever become. And without another word, they lifted the bucket together, turned toward the house, and walked forward, not following a path laid out for them, but one they had already begun to make with every step they chose to take side by side.